Good morning. I'm going to give it a couple minutes. I see a bunch of attendees all starting to come into the webinar. But we are all here to go through some NEPA, that's National Environmental Policy Act onboard training. We're here to bring folks together to teach you what the NEPA process is, what the PD&E process is. And we'll go through this agenda. Let's see, the attendees are coming in. Okay, so first off, what we're going to do, you should be able to see the agenda on the screen. I'll come back to that in just a second, but just so you know, my name is Pete McGilvery. I'm one of the environmental administrators for the Florida Department of Transportation. I manage the SWEPT application, the statewide environmental project tracker, which is a key component to this particular training. It's a web-based application that allows us to create environmental documentation that can also go through the review and approval process. With me, we have a full team. I'm going to hand it off and we're going to go around. The first one I'm going to introduce is Ruth Roazza. You're on mute, Ruth.
Thank you. I'm Ruth. I'm the team leader on the SWEPT application. I'm happy to be here. We'll be showing you a demo later today. And Roy?
I'm Roy Jackson, and I serve as the State Cultural and Recreational Resources Coordinator, and I will be doing a presentation on the Section 106 process.
Good morning, I'm Katasha Cornwell. I'm the State Environmental Process Administrator.
Hi, good morning. My name is Tu Clark. I am a Project Delivery Coordinator and will be working with DEP and the grantees out there to make sure your documents are ready for the Rec Trails funding.
Good morning, I'm Stephanie Clemens. I'm one of the developers on the SWEPT application, and I also staff the OEM help desk.
Fantastic, Stephanie. Okay, so to just kind of kick us off and give us a context for what we're here to do, we've got the Rec Trails program over at DEP. DEP uses FHWA funds to fund priority projects and go through the various process to be able to have access to FHWA funds. Part of having access to FHWA funds requires that we perform environmental analysis consistent with federal requirements. Now, something that's very interesting about Florida is we are one of about 6 or 7 states around the country that have gotten what they call NEPA assignment. Again, that's National Environmental Policy Act assignment, which is you have to complete the environmental documentation phase in order to move throughout the federal process and receive future federal funding. Within Florida, Florida Department of Transportation was able to get this NEPA assignment, which means the Florida Department of Transportation actually serves as FHWA within Florida for environmental processing and approvals. So in order for your projects to be funded as grantees, we have to complete the environmental process to standards that support the federal funding action. So that being said, that's the nuts and bolts of what this entire process is. We know folks aren't very familiar with NEPA. We know folks aren't familiar with what the requirements are. And so working with our DEP team and the Rec Trails program over at their office, we wanted to make sure we had a consistent approach and provide a webinar to help bring folks up to speed. So those folks you just met on here, they're all going to be resources going forward. Another good note for everybody is we're actually recording this particular session, this webinar, and we're going to provide a link to it. So all the various elements that we go through, we're going to talk through, what is NEPA, what are the expectations for documentation to support, a federal approval by our office. Roy's going to run through our Section 106. And then we have this web-based application that provides electronic document development and approval, and we're going to run through the application itself. We're going to show you how it works and how to fill out the various type 1 checklist, which is a type 1 is a categorical exclusion, and a type 1 is within federal law. It means that certain projects of certain types aren't going to have a significant impact on the environment because they're not going to have a significant impact on the environment, there's less documentation that needs to happen ultimately, but the considerations still need to be thought about and they still need to be documented appropriately. For much larger projects, you would do a much more involved process. We're not here to run through that today. And then we'll finish up with a question and answer session throughout. We'll probably after each section stop and see whether or not there's questions. And just so if you have questions, you've got the chat interface, please use it, ask questions in there. We have folks on our team that are monitoring everything. And after each session, they'll engage the presenter and go through the questions, and we'll make sure everybody's on the same page with what those outcomes are, and hopefully you'll get answers to your questions. We've also put together some additional resources for you guys. A lot of these things are either in a manual, which is accessed in that first link above. We have lots of other recorded sessions, a lot of various elements of considerations, like maybe you need to think about threatened and endangered species. Maybe you have to think about how you're going to deal with the Coast Guard. Hopefully none of those things are that much on these type 1s. But if there are particular concerns that you really need some more detail on, we've got some recorded training sessions that are on that PD&E NEPA recorded training opportunities site. And then if you really want to get a little bit more detail on how SWEPT actually works, we've got individual training sessions on there as well. Although I would tell you that what you guys are going to be doing within our application, the session today, the recording today that you're going to see is very much targeted to exactly the work that you're going to do. And again, we're going to post it. We'll give this to the DEP team. They'll share it with everybody. We'll make sure everybody who attended the webinar has access to it. And then of course, we're going to put it on our website and make sure that link is available as well.
All right. As rec trail applicants for the federal highway funding, your agency must understand the requirements for the National Environmental Policy Act, just like Pete just mentioned earlier. So in this session, we will talk about NEPA and how FDOT process that you're going to need to follow to demonstrate and document compliance with NEPA. So what is NEPA? It is the National Environmental Policy Act that established a national policy for protection of the environment and to raise awareness of the importance of natural resources. NEPA was signed into law on January 1st, 1970, and requires federal agencies to assess the environmental effects of their proposed actions prior to making decisions. NEPA is sometimes referred to as an umbrella, as compliance with NEPA requires compliance with other environmental laws such as the Clean Water Act, National Historic Preservation Act, and the Endangered Species Act, just to name a few. All federal agencies are subject to NEPA. The Federal Highway Administration assigned NEPA responsibilities to FDOT back in December of 2016. So therefore, the FDOT is now responsible for all environmental regulations for highway projects, and it also includes NEPA responsibility for recreational trail documents that are managed by FDEP. The Project Development and Environment, or PD&E Manual, provides procedures on how the department complies with NEPA and other laws, executive orders, and regulations. It provides guidance on how to determine a project's class of action and how to conduct appropriate analysis to demonstrate environmental compliance. Following the manual will ensure compliance with NEPA and other laws, executive orders, and regulations. The PD&E Manual comes in two parts. Part 1 details the process and documentation, and Part 2 details specific topics and how they should be analyzed. I'm going to send your attention to Part 1, Chapter 2 of the manual, which is the class of action determination for federal projects. Here you will find information on how to determine the level of environmental document you will need to satisfy NEPA. There are 3 classes of action for federal projects, as shown on the bottom of this slide. The class of action is dependent upon whether the project will have significant impacts. Projects with significant impacts require the development of an environmental impact statement, or EIS. Projects with a question of significance requires the development of an environmental assessment, or EA, and projects with no significant impacts are categorically excluded from the development of an EA or EIS. In many cases, the determination of significance will be obvious because the absence of resources or because the proposed action does not impact resources. In other cases, the degree to which the project may affect a resource will need to be considered closely. In Florida, we have a Type 1 and Type 2 categorical exclusions. The Type 1 categorical exclusions are listed in 23 CFR 771C or D. Common Type 1 CEs that we use are C3, which is the construction of bicycle and pedestrian lanes, paths, and facilities, C7 for landscaping, C9 for emergency repairs. And the rest are listed in the CFR as well as in Part 1, Chapter 2 of the manual. But the summary of all of this is that all categorical exclusions must not have significant impacts. But, and basically recreational trails will typically be a Type 1 CE, and a C3 would most likely be the appropriate C type for your project, which is the construction of bicycle and pedestrian lanes, paths, and facilities. So in the previous slide, I mentioned that the level of documentation is determined on whether the project impacts on resources are significant. But how is significance determined? The determination as to whether a project has significant impacts is made for a variety of resources. These are just some of them. The full list of resources are found in the PD&E manual. For example, if you wanted information on how wetlands are addressed, you can look in Part 2, Chapter 9 of the PD&E manual. Impacts to species are found in Part 2, Chapter 16, and impacts to contamination are found in Part 2, Chapter 20. And I highlight those because those are some of the things that you're going to need to analyze as part of your Type 1 CE. So to illustrate how significance is determined, let's look at this example. Currently, my teenagers are enrolled in online school with a local high school. The teacher who is in the classroom instructs both students in the classroom and those online. Reliable internet is required for the teacher to teach students who are at home. So if the internet goes out at my house, only my student is impacted. Is that a significant impact? No, probably not. Because the class, the teacher can still instruct the rest of the class. My student is just going to have to do some catch-up work later. But if the internet goes out for the entire region and all online students cannot attend the class, there may be a question of significance. But we need to look a little bit further. How many students are online versus in class? We will probably need to look, a bit closer at that to determine the significance. And in the scenario, what if the teacher gets sick? Is that a significant impact? It definitely could be, because the teacher could be the only one certified to teach that particular class. But then again, the principal might step in and say, hey, we have another qualified substitute teacher to teach the class, and then you don't have a significant impact anymore. So if we look at this classroom scenario where one student loses internet connection, that would not be a significant impact, and a categorical exclusion is appropriate. Where the internet is out in the entire area, there is a question of significance, and an environmental assessment would be appropriate. And where the teacher gets sick and cannot teach, that could be a significant impact, where an environmental impact statement would be warranted. And granted, this is just an example to illustrate how we talk about looking at a particular resource, looking at a particular project to determine how our project's impacts would be the resource and how significance would be determined. Okay. So, but historically, I think most of the recreational trail projects have been documented as categorical exclusions, meaning that these projects, based on past experience with similar actions, have not individually or cumulatively have had a significant environmental effect, and therefore is excluded from the requirements to prepare an EA or an EIS. In addition, in order to be a categorical exclusion, the project must not involve significant environmental impacts, induce significant impacts to planned growth or land use for the area, require the relocation of significant numbers of people, have significant impact on any natural, cultural, recreational, historic, or other resource, involve significant air, noise, or water quality impacts, have significant impacts on travel patterns, or otherwise either individually or cumulatively have any significant environmental impacts. The Type 1 CE determination is made by using the Type 1 CE checklist in the statewide environmental project tracker, also known as SWEPT. The checklist is completed to determine if the project meets the CE criteria in the CFR, Code of Federal Regulations. If the project does not meet the checklist criteria, coordination with DEP and OEM, which is our office, must occur. This may require screening in the environmental screening tool, completing a technical study to assess the impact to particular resources, coordination with resource agency or the public, and the preparation of a higher document level, typically a Type 2 categorical exclusion. Type 2 categorical exclusions are also reviewed and approved by our office, but we anticipate most FDEP projects meeting the requirements to be a Type 1 CE. There are 30 C-listed categorical exclusions in 23 CFR 771, but C3, as I mentioned earlier, will typically be used for the construction of bicycle and pedestrian lanes, paths, and facilities. So this is typically the one that's going to be used for DEP rec trail projects. So let's walk through some of the information that you're going to need to create for Type 1 CE. And what I've done through the next series of slides is actually pulled screenshots of the SWEPT tool so we can kind of walk through what's going to be required. First, for FDEP rec trail projects, there is one assigned FM number, which is 404-189-1-A8. And the last two digits are going to be identified for year. And so I believe for 2018, it was 25. The 2019 project should be 26. And as we move forward with future years, it will just advance from there. Because the same FM is used for all FDEP rec trail projects, it is important to add identifiers when creating your Type 1 CE form. For example, you can add in project name and the county. All the other fields are pre-populated in the system. At the bottom of the screen, you will also indicate whether this is a local agency program. This response should be no, because this is for the local agency program, also known as LAP, which is funded under a different source and not the recreational trails program. You are also going to be asked to select the appropriate CE type. You can have either C or D, but we think most of these should be the C3 category. And in the box that you can see, I've already selected C3, but all the other categorical exclusion types will be listed. You're also going to need to add in the project description. The project description must be written to allow a person without prior knowledge of the project to clearly understand what the project is. The project description must include the following information: a brief description of the existing facility, the limits of the proposed project, such as the length and logical termini, which is the beginning and the end of the project, the names of the city and the county where the project is located, a brief description of the proposed improvements, a brief description of the pedestrian and bicycle accommodation, navigational needs, if any, and a project location map illustrating project limits. The map should display any landmarks mentioned in describing the proposed project action, such as cities, towns, rivers, and other resources in the project area. And for more information on an appropriate project description, please refer to Part 2, Chapter 1, Project Description and Purpose and Need. Next, you must verify that the project meets the constraints of 23 CFR 771.117, which is specifically saying that the project will not induce significant impacts to planned growth or land use for the area, travel patterns, involve significant air or water quality impacts, or cause substantial controversy on environmental grounds. You do this by selecting the box next to the verified box right there. And as mentioned earlier, projects that are being documented as a categorical exclusion must not have any significant impacts. The first question that you're going to answer is the right-of-way question. So will the project require property acquisition? Typically, only minor right-of-way acquisitions are allowable for Type 1 CEs. Any right-of-way required will need to be detailed in the comment box provided. Will the project require any relocations? When relocations are anticipated for a project, information regarding residences, businesses, and institutional community facilities that may be relocated will need to be summarized. If the project requires a relocation, please work with FDEP and also our office, and we will probably need to discuss. Most of our projects we anticipate will not be requiring any relocations. More information on relocations can be found in Part 2, Chapter 4 of the PD&E manual. You will need to include information on wetlands and understand the federal permit type your project will be required to obtain. Detail wetland impacts in the space provided and include permit authorization that will be required. Trail projects would typically qualify under Nationwide Permit Type 3, which is the maintenance nationwide permit, where you can repair, rehabilitate, or replace previously authorized current serviceable structures or fills. Nationwide 23 might also be appropriate, which is approved category exclusions, and also Nationwide 42 recreational facilities. You will need to contact your core permitting office representative to ensure that the appropriate permit type will be obtained for your project. For more information about wetlands, refer to Part 2, Chapter 9, and another resource is Part 1, Chapter 12, Environmental Permitting. Both are in the PD&E manual. You will also need to know if there's going to be a Coast Guard bridge permit required. If you have a project that's going to require a Coast Guard bridge permit, please contact us. We'll need to consider whether a Type 1 CE is the appropriate class of action for this project. For floodplains, protection of floodplains and floodways is required by Executive Order 11988, Floodplain Management. The intent of these regulations is to avoid or minimize highway and land use development encroachments that reduce storage and increase water surface elevations within base floodplains. Where encroachment is unavoidable, the regulations require FDOT to take appropriate measures to minimize or mitigate impacts. Further guidance can be found in the Executive Order 11988 and also can be found in guidelines for implementing Executive Order 11988 floodplain management. You can also look at Part 2, Chapter 13, floodplains for more information. FDEP recreational trails should more than likely select no floodplain present, no floodplain impact, or functionally dependent use or facilities open space use. Next, you're going to have to determine whether there is involvement with wild and scenic river or study river. You're going to need to refer to Part 2, Chapter 12, Wild and Scenic Rivers for more information. But as we talk about this today, the only wild and scenic rivers or study rivers in Florida are the Loxahatchee, St. Mary's, and Mayaca River. If your project is within the limits listed in this section, you will need to call our office before you can complete this form. You will also need to determine whether your project will have impacts or involve a river on the Nationwide Rivers Inventory. Note that there is a link in the SWEP tool for the NRI interactive map, and you can use that to determine whether your project is in an area of on the Nationwide Rivers Inventory. If you have an adverse effect, you cannot process this as a Type 1 CE. You will also need to understand how your project impacts protected species and essential fish habitat. You're going to provide a list of potential species that may occur in the action area. Lists can be obtained by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or National Marine Fisheries Service. You can also use the environmental screening tool or a tool called Information for Planning and Consultation, which is called IPAC, or other service provided sources for federally listed species. A ranking of probability occurrence along with a definition of those probabilities should also be provided. The service's online species list, available data sources, current literature, and species specialists may also be consulted to help identify what federally listed species may be in the project area. Include species and critical habitats proposed for federal listing, as well as federal candidate species on the list. Federally designated critical habitat within the action area also needs to be identified. FHWA projects require documentation of compliance with the Endangered Species Act and the Magnuson-Stevens Fisheries Conservation Act, kind of like I mentioned in the previous slide. A species evaluation is required for all environmental documents in accordance with FHWA's 2002 memorandum titled Management of Endangered Species Act, Environmental Analysis and Consultation Process. If there are no listed species in the action area, then an explanation outlining the methodology used to make that conclusion must be provided. This is also the same if there are no EFH in the project area. If there are listed species present and no consultation is required, select the second option. If consultation is required, select option C. And I'd also like to add that if you require consultation, you're going to need to prepare documentation for our review, and as the lead agency, we will help make sure you complete consultation for protected species and essential fish habitat. All right, and so this one is also, so in the area where you have ESA listed species and or essential fish habitat present, you have the option to determine whether there's no effect, or you can use consultation keys, and that completes your consultation requirements for EFH and ESA. And if you choose those options, you will provide the description of what occurred in the comment box in this particular section. If you have consultation with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or National Marine Fisheries, you have the option of may affect, not likely to adversely affect, where you're going to be attaching the concurrence letter. And then if you have may affect, likely to adversely affect, you're going to need to be working with us because this might not necessarily be the appropriate class of action for your particular project, and we're going to need to talk further. If the project is located outside of areas where the Magnuson-Stevens Fishery Act applies, an EFH assessment is not required and consultation with National Marine Fisheries is not required. And most FDEP projects hopefully fall into this category. Section 4F is the next question you're going to come up upon. Section 4 refers to the original section within the U.S. Department of Transportation Act of 1966, which provided for consideration of park and recreational lands, wildlife and waterfowl refuges, and historic sites during transportation project development. The law applies to U.S. DOT and is implemented by the Federal Highway Administration. Section 4 properties include significant publicly owned public parks, recreation activities, and wildlife or waterfowl refuges, and any publicly or privately owned historic site listed or eligible for listing on the National Register of Historic Places. This statement, however, will be automatically populated in the Type 1 CE form. Since recreational trails are funded under the Federal Trails Program, they are exempt from review from Section 4 of the USD Act of 1966. Rec trails need to demonstrate compliance with Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act. And I will just show you what the options are here, but Roy's going to talk more specifically about Section 106 requirements in the presentation after this one. For most trail projects, this should be a no for noise analysis, and is not required as the proposed project is a Type 3 project. So this standard statement is going to be included, which states that the proposed project is a Type 3 project and does not require a noise analysis or consideration of abatement measures. Now, there might be some of those projects that have alternative, the vehicle, the rec trail project that allows recreational vehicles, and in that case, we'll probably need to have a discussion. So, but the majority of the projects should be it should not be required. For contamination, include a brief summary of level 1 evaluation in the type 1 form. And you'll need to upload the level 1 contamination report, tech memo, or contamination clearance letter, as well as documentation of subsequent assessment as appropriate in SWEPT. The level 1 evaluation is performed to screen potentially contaminated sites that are within or adjacent to the project. The level 1 evaluation does not involve sampling and testing soil or groundwater. The information obtained from the level 1 evaluation should be sufficient enough to determine potential contamination risk on each project alternative. The level 1 evaluation consists of desktop review of the proposed project scope of work, contamination related records, site reconnaissance, field review, interviews, estimating risk ratings, and preparation of a report or technical memo. And please refer to Part 2, Chapter 20, and that talks more about contamination. For planning consistency, the supporting information should be uploaded is the project priority list, highlighting the subject project. Use the tip-step link to upload the appropriate planning consistency documents. And once you get all of that information loaded, eventually you'll get to this slide where you can save the draft or send the project for approval. The approval of the Type 1 CE is handled by our office. We will confirm that the files are complete and SWEPT and the appropriate information is included on the form to support the decision that the project is a Type 1 CE. This is just the cover page of what a Type 1 CE looks like. Notice how each area that was discussed as a part of this presentation has a section on the form starting with the project details and continuing with resource summaries. And I know we went through this quite quickly, but I have to point out that lots of this information is available on our OEM website, including, of course, our PD&E manual, both parts 1 and part 2, as well as computer-based trainings on the different parts of part 1 and part 2 to help you navigate through the Type 1 CE process as you are preparing your form. All right, and I think that is all I have.
Hi, Tu. We have a couple of questions from Mira. The first one is, how are we supposed to know if consultation is required for endangered species?
Well, that's going to depend on, you're going to have an understanding of what is in your project area. And if you recall, I had mentioned a few tools that you can use to see first what species are listed in your project area, and then how to determine what impacts that your project is going to have on those particular species. We do have species keys that are available that you can get to, you know, a no effect or may affect, not likely to adversely affect. But for certain species, if you end up with a may affect, not likely to adversely affect, you still need to get concurrence from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or the National Marine Fisheries Service. So hopefully for your particular project, you're going to be working with qualified consultants, biologists that can help you get to that answer. And then we can be here to help support that as well.
Thank you, Tu. The second question from Mira is a level 1 required of all projects, even if we think there is no contamination consideration?
If you have documentation that there is no contamination in your area, the appropriate documentation should be in the file to support that. But the level 1 should be something fairly simple to complete. And I can go back to that slide real quick, hopefully, about what is required for contamination. So let's see. I mean, you're going to have something to put in the file to confirm that there is no contamination in the project area. And I think when we were talking to internally, typically a level 1 is the appropriate documentation. But if you have particular scenarios that you want to run through with us, we can talk on a project by project basis as well.
Thank you, you two. We have a couple of questions from Katie. The first one is, can you repeat the resources for determining species present at the project site?
Okay, let's see. Get back to that slide. Hold on, I'm just trying to find, okay. So the resources, you can reach out to, of course, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. They have the ability to help you determine what species are in your project area, but you will also have access to the environmental screening tool, which has some of that information. And then also the one that can be very useful for you is called the Information for Planning and Consultation, which is called IPAC. That is something that is used by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So definitely reach out to U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and they can help you make sure you have the appropriate list for your project area.
Thank you. The second question from Katie is, would invasive treatment by licensed pesticide applicator be considered a substantial controversy on environmental grounds?
I have not seen that as something as rising to the level of controversy, but maybe, Katasha, have you heard of something like that for, removing exotics or invasive species? I don't think so, but that has not come across for me.
Yeah, for me either. In my experience, that would normally not be a controversial issue.
Thanks, Katasha.
Thank y'all. Let's see. All right, next question is from Mira. Last year, July 2019, we were asked to provide much of this documentation relating to NEPA. Do you already have this documentation or will we need to resubmit it?
I think that question is probably more appropriate for DEP. As of this point, DOT does not have any information that is at a place where we can review and approve. So the application process runs through DEP first, and then the projects are prioritized, and then the completed document is sent to OEM at FDOT for review and approval. As of today, we don't have anything that is ready for review and approval at FDOT.
Thank you. The next question is from Julie, and she would like to know, if documents are missing after submitting, will your office notify the grantees and give a chance to fix any omissions or errors?
Definitely, there's going to have to be close coordination between the grantee, DEP, and OEM. We certainly will not be able to approve any document without the appropriate documentation. So there will have to be communication, whether it's directly from our office here or we go through the DEP office to work with you as the grantee. So definitely there should be an opportunity to make sure any missing documentation is included before we complete our review, and we will not be approving anything with incomplete information.
Thank you. The next question is from Julie as well. If the grantee is a biologist or wetland scientist, is this a qualifying profession to complete the protected species and essential fish habitat section?
Yes.
Thank you. A follow-up to one of Katie's previous questions is, so we don't have to complete NEPA documentation unless our project is prioritized by DEP after application submission.
That is correct. So DEP has their prioritization process, and at that point, the grantees will be notified and then also given access to SWEPT. And then at that point, you will be creating the Type 1 CE using SWEPT and moving forward to getting your NEPA document approved.
I hope everybody's having a good morning. I'm going to be discussing the National Historic Preservation Act, and the requirements related to it for historic properties. It's going to be primarily about the National Historic Preservation Act, but we have two methods of compliance, or I shouldn't say two methods of compliance. We have a programmatic agreement that we've established with the SHPO and the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation in Washington that gives us some alternate evaluation processes for it. And Section 106 applies to all federal agencies and all federally funded or licensed projects, which will include the recreational trails program. To begin with 106, I think the most important thing is to start with the terminology that is used, because frequently people refer to it as cultural resources. They're generally referred to as historic sites, but normally most people tend to differentiate between archaeological sites and historic sites, simply because of the different professionals that are involved. But a historic site or a cultural resource, any historic site is a cultural resource. And the types of sites are listed in the evaluation criteria for the National Register of Historic Places. They're buildings, objects, structures, landscapes, districts, or archaeological sites. To be called historic only requires them to be of 50 years of age or older. There is a little bit of leeway there, in that if you have something that is of extraordinary significance or of extraordinary importance, you may know that well before the 50 years are up. That was especially true back when we were dealing with World War II resources. Most of those we knew were going to be significant prior to them reaching 50 years of age, and also in Florida, the space program related resources. And a cultural resources is simply, in the way we're going to be using it today, is simply kind of a synonym for historic resources. There gets to be a little bit more subtlety when you deal with Native American resources or Native sites that Native Americans may have attaching importance to. Now, the difference between a cultural resource and a historic property is probably something that is important for you to know. And one of the things I want to distinguish straight out is that the cultural or historic resource is any prehistoric, that the same listing I just gave you, district, site, building, structure, object, that is 50 years of age or older, which means that a trail in an existing trail in a park could itself be an element of a historic property. We ran into that in Miami, where there was a specifically designed trail or pathway in a park from the 1920s. And so the actual layout of that trail was a historic feature of that property. Now, a historic property, and this is the important part, a historic property is any cultural resource that has been determined significant. And for the purposes of Section 106 in the National Historic Preservation Act, significance means that it is either eligible for inclusion or it is already included in the National Register of Historic Places, or the NRHP. Notice that little purple reference down at the bottom, because a lot of what we do is going to be tied, or a lot of what you do is going to be tied to the regulations, the implementing regulations of the National Historic Preservation Act. So we've already taken care of the most important definitions at the get-go. Other definitions may come up as we go through, but generally this is what we're going to be covering in this presentation. Those definitions and explanations I just gave, the legal authorities, the general Section 106 process, the National Register criteria, our section, the FDOT Section 106 process, because as I said, we have a programmatic agreement that has certain stipulations that give us a little bit of flexibility in the detail to which we must go to identify, evaluate, and look at effects to historic properties with. And then some final notes on qualifications and the important role of the public plays in consulting parties as they're defined in Section 106. In the determinations both of the significance and importance of the resources, as well as in weighing the effects that a project may have on a particular historic property. The legal authority, and this is the most important one for our purposes today, are the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966 as amended. the National Historic Preservation Act was passed by Congress to ensure that the impacts of growth and development triggered by federal projects that are carried out by federal agencies or approved by federal agencies, that the effects of those projects on the historic resources are taken into account, because frequently federal aid projects beginning in the 60s started to destroy or damage a large number of historic properties. And so the federal government, enough voters complained to their representatives that eventually that they got around to passing a National Historic Preservation Act. There were earlier preservation acts going all the way back to Teddy Roosevelt's American Antiquities Act. The second part of that is our programmatic agreement. It was originally between FHWA, the Advisory Council, the Florida Division on Historic Resources, the DHR, as you all probably know them best. The director of the DHR serves as the State Historic Preservation Officer, and then FDEP, of course. We wrote it and also signed it. And it's for the implementation of the Federal Aid Highway Program in Florida, which is inclusive of the Recreational Trails Program, because it's a federal aid project through the FHWA. The Section 106 PA is what we call that agreement for short, and the Section 106 PA outlines the FDOT's process for compliance, and it's all well within the confines of the 106 process. And as a note, along with the NEPA assignment, the FHWA is no longer a participant in that 106 programmatic agreement document, except in rare instances where the Native American tribe may request government-to-government consultation with them. I don't foresee that happening much on a trail project, but I don't want to leave it out, because if I leave it out, it'll happen. That's my experience. And the Section 106 is the actual driver behind our Section 106 process, and that process is defined in 36 CFR Part 800, the 36 Code of Federal Regulations Part 800, various sections in them, and it sets out a 4-step process, which we'll go into more detail in with the succeeding slides. But there's the initiation of the Section 106 process, then the identification of the historic properties, then the determination of adverse effect. Are historic properties going to be applying the criteria of adverse effect? Are they going to be adversely affected? And then the resolution of adverse effects. And that's one we're hoping that we don't run into much on trail projects, because once we get into adverse effects, then we won't be able to pursue a Type 2, or Type 1 CE rather, excuse me, a Type 1 CE. In initiating the Section 106 process, there are a couple of activities, and each one of these steps has an exit point. You'll see noted on each of these slides that are on the steps. The establishing an undertaking is simply determining, for federal undertakings, it's simply determining whether or not there's federal funding or federal approvals that are going to be required for the project. If that is true, then it's a federal undertaking. Works the same way for state undertakings. If the project involves an agency of the executive branch of the state government as a funding source or as an approving agent, then that triggers the state historic preservation law, which is Chapter 267 of the Florida statutes. It requires coordinating it with other reviews as appropriate. Most commonly for us, for these projects anyway, that's going to be coordinating it with the NEPA review. And then initiate consultation. Every 106 protected property, or every property that may be protected by 106, may have parties that are interested in the undertaking or in the effects of the undertaking on the historic property. And those are the consulting parties. They can include anybody, the general public, business that's near the project or alongside the project, or an agency that may have property that they have control over alongside the project, or the property goes through. So that's part of identifying those parties is part of the initiation of the consultation. The SHPO is always a consulting party unless it's a project on tribal lands, which should not occur with the Rec Trails program. And creating a public involvement plan is part of initiating consultation. And then at that point, you notify any of the parties that you may believe have an interest in the project to inform them that the project is occurring. The most appropriate being the State Historic Preservation the State Historic Preservation Officer, excuse me. The exit point on the step one is that you have no undertaking. So for example, if there was no federal involvement in the project at all for permits or for funding, then if it was a recreational trail we were funding with state funds only, which isn't really part of this program, but it's the best example I can give you at the time, you would have no federal undertaking. And the other exit point is that the project that you are planning, the project you have planned out, has no potential to cause effects to historic properties. And when making that determination, it's important to note that you have to assume that such properties may be present in the area of the project. And that determination is going to be based heavily on the types of activities that are associated with the project. Because there are certain things that if it's happening right on a historic resource, it's probably going to have the potential to cause effects. And you may not know at this time because you have yet to do an identification of the historic properties involved. The second step begins with the identification of historic properties, begins with determining the area of potential effect, and the identification of the historic properties that are within that area of potential effect. The area of potential effect is the area within which the undertaking may cause alterations in the character or use of historic properties, if any exist. And as I said before, the regulations state an assumption that they do exist there, but you may not know what kind they are, and different kinds of properties are sensitive to different kinds of effects. It's also influenced by the scale and nature of the undertaking, and may be different for different kinds of effects. It should include all the project alternatives that you're going to be weighing, all locations that may be subject to ground disturbing activity, because obviously archaeological resources would be very sensitive to ground disturbing activity, any staging or storage area for materials or equipment, lay down yards or anything like that, all locations from which elements of the proposed undertaking may be visible or audible. Because the criteria of effect, or when you're looking to see what may be affected, you have to include both direct effects, indirect effects, and effects which may be cumulative or may be removed in time or distance to the project, ones that are easily discernible. For example, if we, the DOT, were to widen a 2-lane road to a 4-lane road, up to the edge of a 2-lane historic bridge, it would be a safe assumption to say that eventually we're going to have to widen that 2-lane bridge. So we would have to include that as part of our area of potential effect. Then you go on to the second part, and this part is where sometimes you can combine findings or steps, and these are the two most common. This is the point at which most joining of determinations may occur, or steps may occur, and that's in the identification of historic properties. If you identify historic resources, say, or if we identify historic resources and we determine that they're not eligible for listing on the National Register of Historic Places, and we determine that in consultation with the SHPO and the other appropriate consulting parties, then everybody's agreed that there are no historic properties present, then you'd certainly have no potential. There will be no historic properties affected. If there are none in existence in the APE for the project, then you won't be affecting any. And that's sort of the exit point for this step, and it takes you out of the 106 process before you get into whether or not, before you apply the criteria of adverse effect, which is the third step in the process. And that's where you identify eligibility. Now, at this point, there's going to be some slides that are going to be very busy. I kind of apologize for that, but it's just the nature of the beast. This is the National Register criteria for evaluation. I don't expect you to remember them. One of the reasons there's some references on some of these slides is because I knew the slides would be retained for your future review. So there's references on the slides where to find these information. Most of this information can be found either in the regulations, which are referenced in the PD&E chapter, chapter 8 of the part 2, or in the programmatic agreement. All of those of which are also linked to our web page, our office web page. The criteria of evaluation simply means that there's 4 criteria of significance, or types of association, and there's 7 aspects of integrity, and they're listed on this slide along with the 4 criteria. Normally, archaeological sites are evaluated by archaeologists under criterion D. The ones that have yielded or may be likely to yield information important in history or prehistory. But occasionally when those kinds of sites are sent to the tribes, along with information, any of the tribes that have cultural or historic association with Florida, they may have a different opinion in that matter. So with archaeological sites, a lot of times consultations with the tribes are very, very important. But once again, if nothing meets these criteria or has no integrity or does not meet the requirements of integrity, then it will not be eligible, and you won't have to consider the project under 106 past that point. You just record the basis on which the determination is made, along with the Cultural Resources Assessment Survey we conducted to identify the historic resources and evaluate them, the properties, and go from there. Now, assessing adverse effects. This is something that once you get to, you want to end with no historic properties adversely affected. That's kind of the main intent of the law. Because once you get to a finding of adverse effect, then we won't be doing a type 1 CE anymore. Now, there's a couple of ways this can be arrived at. You can identify a property that's eligible for the National Register in the area of potential effects, and we may even have to acquire or demolish that property in the design that we have outlined for the project. But we may identify, once we determine that we have a significant historic property there, we may determine that we can avoid it and not damage it. And that way, that's one way to avoid not having an adverse effect. You have to consult with the SHPO on these determinations along with the other consulting parties. One of the key points of the Section 106 process, and if we go back to the flow chart that I provided earlier, you'll see down the left-hand side coordination and our consultation. Consultation is involved throughout the Section 106 process with the consulting parties and with the public as appropriate. And the exit point for this is no historic properties adversely affected. Now, this photograph was chosen by Matt Marino, who originally developed this particular presentation, or the outlines for this particular presentation. And I retained this structure, even though I know very little about it, because it would be obviously this particular property obviously could be easily affected by visual impacts that could have an adverse effect. But that whole one side of the house being glass, that means the view out of it, if not the view into it, but certainly the view out of it would be terribly important. If a roadway was to go through that view shed, or a trail was to go through that view shed, it certainly has the potential to adversely affect the setting of that property in a way that would diminish its historic value. And that's really what the criteria of adverse effect is. There's several examples given in the regulations: physical destruction or damage to all of the part of the property, alteration of the property, alteration to the setting of the property in such a way that it damages the historic characteristics of the property. There's a number of examples. Really what it comes down to is, does the property still retain its sufficient integrity to reflect its historic association and what makes it historic to begin with? And then the next point, the next stop in the 106 process is resolving adverse effects. And that normally involves a mitigation effort of some kind. I did put 4 mitigation examples of mitigation that we've done in the past that we do. One is of an archaeological excavation, which is the most common form of mitigation for an archaeological site. There's an example of a historic American building survey drawing of the facade of a building. That's a record of a historic building. There's another one called the Historic American Engineering Record, and there's an example in the upper right-hand corner of one of the piers of the Blountstown Truss Bridge over the Apalachicola River Bridge, which we did roughly 20 years ago. And then at the bottom center, we took the main span of the Lake Monroe Swing Bridge, which was a truss bridge, and we removed it from the bridge and installed it as a fishing pier on a county park that was alongside the original roadway ran when we replaced that bridge. But once again, once you get to resolving adverse effects, you're in a memorandum of agreement or another appropriate agreement document depending on the circumstances. And that is not normally, you're not normally going to be able to do that as a type 1 CE. The best you would be able to get in most of those circumstances would be a type 2. I don't foresee a trail. The most likely kinds of impacts where you could have an adverse effect with a trail that would trigger some sort of memorandum of agreement would be the archaeological excavation one, in case the trail was going to damage an archaeological site. Now I want to get into real quickly, because once again, this is even more difficult. This part was even more difficult to make slides of, because this is some examples from the programmatic agreement we have with Federal Highways. I mean, with the Advisory Council and the SHPO. We have 3 stipulations that I want to draw your attention to in the 106 PA, because they break down project types as certain types of projects meeting certain conditions, which you have a somewhat more minor recording effort in order to document the finding to the State Historic Preservation Officer and the other consulting parties. They're a set. All of these stipulations, the first 2, 5, and 6 anyway, are the ones that scale back the level of effort and certainly the level of recording of the effort. You don't have a large cultural resources assessment survey to complete for these. You don't have to do as detailed a field work to get to them, but they're based on 2 things. They're based on the type of project, focusing, primarily on what activities are associated with that project. Because, for example, you could have a project that is simply placing a certain kind of paving on a recreational trail, and that could be the recreational trail project, and that is far likely to cause effects to historic properties than, say, if you had to clear and grub through a forest to install a recreational trail. So you can see some just for trails, there's a range of ways that you can increase or decrease the potential to have effects. 5 and 6 are the streamlined versions of compliance. As stipulation 7 just takes you back into the standard section 106 review. Stipulation 6, this is just an example. The less documentation that is required for compliance, and then it has a set of following conditions. It has to be a standalone project. When you look on the forms, and I have there's some images of the forms here, but you can't really read the form itself. You'll have to go to the chapter or to the programmatic agreement to actually read the forms. The lists of activities and then the lists of conditions. Obviously, if a project occurs on tribal lands, then it's out of the programmatic agreement because none of the tribes are signatories to the programmatic agreement. The activities that are listed for the stipulation 6 projects, for example, here, there's many more projects listed in stipulation 6 than there are in stipulation 5. And frequently you can do most of these with a desktop and or a minor field review. And if you find there are no historic resources in the APE, then you can go forward with it. If there are historic resources in the APE, it may depend on whether or not those historic resources have been reviewed by SHPA before, what kind of historic resources they are, what kind of impacts they may be subject to. But since the significance determinations have to be made in consultation with the SHPA and the other consulting parties, neither FDOT nor or DEP can unilaterally make a decision that a historic resource is not significant. That's something that has to be done in consultation with the appropriate parties. And when you get to stipulation 7, then you're just in the standard review and you go through the norm. And that can actually sometimes be just as short as one of the minor stipulations. But the minor stipulations we set up to be more formulaic so that we would be able to complete them more easily. And here's an example of the minor minimal impact potential determination form. Both the stipulation 5 and the stipulation 6 projects are included on this one form so that the decision can be made via using the one form, because a lot of times, like I said, the project is going to include many activities. Not all of those activities may be contained within stipulation 5. The stipulation 5 has a small list of activities that are exempted from a detailed review, and you can see them on here for stipulation 5, which is at the top of the page. Installation of fencing, signs, pavement markings, small passenger shelters, etc. In-kind replacement of or ordinary repair of existing lighting, and so forth. There are only 6 activities that are really covered in stipulation 5, and then there are the confirmed conditions that it's a standalone project. Now, by standalone, that doesn't mean it can only be one activity. You could have a project that is all 6 activities listed in 5, and if there are no other activities associated with the project and it meets the rest of these conditions, then it could still be processed as a stipulation 5 project. And Exhibit 2 of the PA sets forth the activities, and number 57 on that list, I believe, is recreational trails. And recreational trails, as Tu mentioned earlier, are also exempted from Section 4F, but not importantly from Section 106, because Section 106 applies to all federal actions, not just USDOT actions, and 4F is specific to conversion of property into a transportation facility. I went a little fast there. This is a little bit more detail on the forms that I continue to show so I can illustrate the forms. And once again, you have to have the form is going to require a description and a justification of the APE. And it's very important to always include maps that show the location of the project, it's the vicinity of the project, and if there are historic resources near the project or just outside of the APE, it's nice to show those relationships. And also the vicinity resources can sometimes indicate whether or not there is a potential for the occurrence of resources inside the APE and would be part of your normal review, even if you're doing just a desktop review of the tool using our EST tool. And there's this, and it gives you an opportunity to describe the methods you use in the survey. Then there's the signature, the verification signature, and the submission instructions. And note at the bottom of the form there is also a link to the 106 PA. But as I said, you can get to that at our website, and that might be easier to use when you're initiating a project. Is to go onto our website, either go to the chapter, which is Part 2, Chapter 8 again, or to go straight to the programmatic agreement, which is also linked on our website. And if neither of those forms will do, then there's the standard review for program undertakings, which, like I said, in some circumstances, say if you have a project that goes near tribal lands, for example, goes alongside tribal lands, you're not going to be able to use one of those forms, because those forms have never been concurred with by the tribes at this point in time. So you couldn't use it for consultation with the tribes, but you would be able to use it for consultation with the SHPOs, and you can use it in informing local governments and so forth, or other forms of consulting parties. The type of report you do, the Cultural Resource Assessment Survey, another source that you want to use to determine what to do for a survey and what a survey may involve is Module 3 of the Guidelines for Use by Historic Preservation Professionals that are put out by the Department of State, the Florida Division of Historical Resources, and that can be found on their webpage as well. In fact, you can just Google Module 3 and that title, and you would find it on the internet. The other documents that occurs, if there are historic resources present and you've determined that they're historic properties, you may still feel that there's no potential that your project will not affect them. And in that case, you would be putting together, or that you think it will affect them, and you're trying to determine if it's an adverse effect. You put together a Section 106 case report. Those are outlined in Module 3 as well, and they're in our Chapter 8 also, and they're also, some of that, a lot of that information is also in a Cultural Resources Management Handbook that can also be accessed from our webpage. And it's got the same submission instructions, because ultimately all this is to comply with 36 CFR Part 800, and 36 CFR Part 800's description of the information to provide is essentially the same for whatever kind of project you're doing. Sufficient information to document your decision and the justification for that decision of whatever your final decision is, whether it's no historic properties affected, no potential to affect historic properties, and no adverse effects to historic properties, any of those. This is the essential table of contents that is provided for by the Department of State for conducting a Cultural Resources Assessment Survey. And if you look down at the bottom, and this might be important for some of the Rec Trails programs, if the project is occurring on state lands, there is a 1A32 archaeological research permit that has to be obtained from the Bureau of Archaeological Resources, which is also underneath the Division of Historic Resources over at the Department of State. And then this is just a really nice reminder that Matt had made that I decided I wanted to keep the text and the picture up. Was a determination. Just if you get a determination of adverse effects, and you're not going to be doing a Type 1 CE anymore. Say you wanted to build it. Say we were trying to build a trail and it had to go through this is going to be the most obvious example I can think of. It has to go through an Indian mound. That's not going to get a no adverse effect. I can kind of promise that. Now, my final notes on this is it's really important that you make sure that you have qualified professionals to conduct your cultural resources assessment surveys. and they can be found in 36 CFR, Part 61 and Appendix A of that. And they have the professional definitions for history, for historians, for archaeologists, and for architectural history. Most of them involve a master's degree or equivalent experience, and that's outlined in those. And throughout, it is important to keep in mind, especially if you have if you're creating a trail for substantial public use in a community that has some historic sensitivity, perhaps you're creating a recreational trail to take advantage of the historical value of the community. You need to make sure the community is engaged in how you bring that trail through, where you want the markers, depending on the kinds of sensitivities. Say if you're in a historic district, the kinds of sensitivities that you may be dealing with, there may be locations where a trail would not be all that, locations through the district where a trail may not be all that much of an enhancement to the resource as the community may see it. So as I mentioned at the very get-go, we had a trail that was a design trail by a significant landscape designer, and we wanted to extend the trail and reconfigure it somewhat. And the SHPO felt that would be an adverse effect, as did the locals. So that actually changed our project, and we eliminated that portion of the project where we extended and reconfigured the existing trail. And these are the resources that I'd mentioned. Once again, they'll be on the slides that are retained from this presentation. I've added in a bullet to the list that was there before, and that is, keep in mind that each FDOT district has a cultural resources coordinator. So if you're working on a recreational trail and it's being handled by one of the districts, there's a good chance you will be working with that cultural resources coordinator if it's in a historic area or if it involves historic properties, because that has to be a check. We have to make a Section 106 finding, and we have to carry it out in order to approve the project. And if you need to contact me at any time, and I'm always, and everybody who works with me can tell you this, I'm always open to any questions. So there's my contact information at the bottom. Thank you for your time, and if there's any questions, I'll be happy to deal with them.
All right, thanks, Roy. We do have one question that has popped up. It's from Mira. The first question is, if there are no historic resources involved, do we still need to have public input and involvement beyond what is done during the application stage for the Rec Trails project?
If there are no historic resources involved, it's generally presumed that you've conducted a cultural resources assessment survey at some level, either a desktop one that identifies nothing of age, or a field visit which identifies no potential for the occurrence of archaeological sites. If we have a survey that confirms there's no historic properties involved or within the area of potential effect of the proposed project, then that's the end of the 106 process. If there's no resources at all, then that can be reported along with whatever research was completed to make that determination to the SHPO, the justification statements, and that's the end of the 106 process. If there are no historic resources present, then you can make that statement that there are no historic resources present. We've done the evaluation, and we're finished with the Section 106 process. But that would require a submittal to the SHPO, and the survey itself may involve talking to the locals that live there. And if it's in what is a sensitive archaeological area, to have looked at some of the information the tribes may have. But if there are no historic resources, nothing of 50 years of age or older there, and no potential for archaeological material, then that's reported to the SHPO, and the finding is no historic properties affected.
All right, thanks, Roy. We do have another question. If the site has no historic or cultural significance, what are the forms that need to be completed? And does a professional in this field still need to complete these forms?
Yes, if we identify historic resources in the area of potential effect, then we have to evaluate them in accordance with the National Register's criteria for eligibility. And so we have to explain that and why they don't meet that eligibility criteria. The forms that have to be filled out are the Florida site file forms, and that's a requirement that comes more from state law than it does from the federal law. And that is so that the State Historic Preservation Officer has the information they need to provide their opinion on historic significance. It would be the finding of, if it would be submitted by like if it was a recreational trail project and it was going to come through the FDOT, then it would be a finding that FDOT would have to provide to the SHPO, and the SHPO would need to concur with it. But the only forms are the Florida site file forms. If there's the stipulation 5 and 6 forms that are used when the project meets those criteria and is defined as one of those kinds of projects, which for this program is going to be primarily those stipulation 6 projects, numbered 57, I believe it was, which are recreational trails. Now keep in mind, and I think the two you had mentioned these in your presentation, is those in environmental alternatives, or those transportation alternatives projects. They do not necessarily equate to the same thing as the recreational trails program. Those are not just openly exempted from certain things that the recreational trails are exempted. But in both cases, you would be likely reporting these under the stipulation 6 type of projects, because you'll confirm visually and in background research that none of the historic properties are eligible. Say they've been too altered. They've had their main facades. They were originally colonial revival houses, and now they look like bungalows because of changes to the facade. Or probably the reverse would be more common. Somebody wanted their house to look like a colonial revival, so they got rid of the bungalow features in the front in the 1990s or something. But those are the forms. It's those two forms, that one form rather, that the minor or the minimal potential to impact form that it was created by the programmatic agreement, and then there are the Florida site file forms, which need to be completed for every historic property or every historic resource. Keep in mind that many of these historic resources may already have Florida site file forms, so that you may just be updating.
Okay, we do have a question from the City of Winter Springs. Currently has a Rec Trails project grant. I was not the original grant writer. Are these forms new to the grant process? And I'm not sure if this is referring to the forms that you just referred to or the Type 1 CE form, but for the Type 1 CE form, the Type 1 CE has been available for quite some time, but with DEP now working with DOT, because we have NEPA assignment, the Type 1 form is automated in that it is generated through the SWEPT tool that is managed by FDOT, so that form is new. But the forms that Roy is referring to, I think those forms have been in existence for a while. So Roy, I'll let you answer that part.
Yeah, they've been in existence from shortly after we completed the original programmatic agreement with the council and SHPO. They were 2 forms. There was a form for the more minor projects, and then a form for the less minor projects. The stipulation 5 projects had their own form, and the stipulation 6 projects had their own form. But then we realized logic dictated that the person would have to go through the provisions of the stipulation 5 material before they would arrive at doing it as a stipulation 6 project. So we combined the forms because everybody was doing both forms. for most projects, because most projects were ending up as stipulation 6 projects. But those, you do not have to do those forms for these projects. The form, once again, if it has to be submitted to a tribe because there may be an archaeological site nearby or something like that, and we did some testing to confirm that the archaeological site did not reach into the project area, and we need to confirm that and need to get the tribe's opinion on that, then we would be sending that to the tribe, but we would not be sending it in one of those forms, at least not at this time. I am talking to the tribes right now a little bit about extending the ability to use those kinds of forms to the tribes. But right now you would have to use those forms if you wanted to report it to the SHPO that way. But keep in mind, those forms are simply a way to report, an easier way to report it. If we already have, and say it's not more than 10 years old or so, if we already have a concurrence from SHPO that there's no potential to affect historic properties, or there's no potential to, or the project is having no effect on historic properties or no adverse effect on historic properties. Any of those findings, if we already have those, there's no necessity or requirement to go back and submit those back to SHPO in the forms. Those forms were made to simplify the coordination with the SHPO. But if you've done the coordination otherwise with the SHPO, simply because if you had to write a notification in a letter form or a letter report or a small technical memorandum to the tribes or to the district, some years ago, and it was submitted to SHPO, and you've got concurrences across the board, and nothing has changed in relation to historic properties on that project, that documentation is still fine.
Okay, and I think that leads us to another question. We had confirmed no historical impacts form July 2019. I'm thinking that's from July 2019. Will these confirmations be acceptable, or do we need current confirmation? And I think you just answered that question, Roy.
Yeah, and we use the term impact here kind of generally. The real findings we look for, at least in 106, and this is a terminology issue, and it's perhaps something I should have inserted at the beginning, is that we tend to talk when we're dealing with section 106, we tend to talk in terms of effects and adverse effects to historic properties, not so much impacts. Now, when you get into the rules that implement Chapter 267 of the Florida statutes, they use the word impacts a lot. But in the statute itself, in our state historic preservation statute, that is also written in terms of effects to historic properties. It's only when you get into the rule, and I think it's it's in our chapter. I think it's the Florida Administrative Code. It's sometimes hard for me to remember because there's several rules there's the rule that governs the permits for archaeological sites, but I think it's 1A42. I could be mistaken. And the 1A42 might very well be the requirement for an archaeological permit for research on state lands. But the rules are cited in the chapter as well. But there's a variety of rules that implement Chapter 267, and they tend to talk in terms of impacts. But impacts is a somewhat, unless we know what the impact is, we can make a determination on effects. But if they say if the DHR responded that there were no impacts, then I think it's safe to presume, that there are no effects.
This video provides an overview of the statewide environmental project tracker, otherwise known as SWEPT, and demonstrates how to prepare a Type 1 categorical exclusion or Type 1 CE. Log into SWEPT with your username and password. To start this demonstration, we will be using a data entry role. The information you'll see comes from our test server and are not live projects. From the SWEPT homepage, we will begin with the My Project section. This section shows a list of projects that you have been assigned to. You can click on the green FM number to open the project page to see more information about a specific project. As you navigate throughout the site, you will see a breadcrumb trail in the upper left-hand corner. Clicking on any of the links in the breadcrumb trail will take you back to a previous page. In the upper right corner, there are account-specific icons. The envelope icon contains the inbox, which shows notifications you have received for SWEPT. The bell icon contains alerts when there is an action that is ready to be taken for a project. The person icon contains the personal account settings. You can change your password, update your contact information, or log out of SWEPT. Depending on a role a user has, the option to delegate authority may also be displayed. This allows the user to temporarily delegate their authority to another user so they may take action on their behalf. For example, a project manager is on extended leave, they can delegate to another user. Below the account-specific icons, and when applicable, you may export to a PDF, zip, Excel spreadsheet, or Word document for a relevant page. When the buttons are not applicable, they will remain grayed out. The search box allows a user to search the SWEPT site for documents, contacts, and projects by typing all or part of a keyword into the search box. For example, you can type in the FM number, part of the project description, or a unique identifier you have assigned to a project. On the left-hand side of the page, click the hamburger menu icon to open and close the left-hand menu. Closing the left-hand menu will allow for more space when working on a Type 1 CE on a smaller screen. The main menu is organized according to key SWEPT tools. The My Alerts and My Inbox link to the same reports as discussed in the account settings. Under Project Input Setup, you will find a link to the Type 1 CE checklist. This is where you will go to create your project and checklist. The Projects Needing Approval section contains District Signatures report that will show a list of all the projects that are ready to be processed. This will also allow users to see where projects are at in the overall process. The Reports portion of the menu contains a categorical exclusion report that will show all CE reports that have been approved in SWEPT. The Help section contains additional guides and documentation for the SWEPT tools and reports, contact information, and our What's New. For additional help, the OEM contact information is displayed at the bottom of every page in SWEPT. We are going to create a new Type 1 CE project and checklist by navigating to the left-hand menu. Here, we will type in the FM number to create the project. Since the FDEP grants program will be using the same FM number for all applications, you will see a dialog that will ask you to choose which project or checklist you would like to edit. In this dialog, each project will show the FM number, additional identifier, a brief project description, the status, and who last edited the checklist and when. If you would like to continue working on a draft checklist, click the radio button next to Edit Existing Checklist for your selected project. If you are creating a new application and are ready to start a new checklist, select the Create a New SWEPT Project option. You will be asked to provide justification for why you are creating a new project with the same FM number. You can type something that is unique to your project. The system will ask you to confirm your selection. Click Create New to proceed with creating the new checklist. The first item you will see is to add an additional identifier. This is where you can add something that is unique to the project or application to help easily identify what it's for and distinguish the project from other FDEP grant program projects with the same FM number. There is no limit to how many identifiers you would like to add. If you would like to relate other projects using the unique identifiers, you can start typing the name of the identifier in the Related Identifiers box. A list matching the content of the text being entered will appear. Click on the desired identifier to add it. The next set of information is automatically pulled in from our work program. Since this is a statewide program, you will notice that the county name says Florida. We suggest that the first thing you put in the project description is the county name to assist in easily identifying the location. The LAP agency program will always be no, since LAP is not applicable to FDEP grant projects. After making the LAP agency selection, we have the categorical exclusion type. This is a code that is in the regulation, and yours will usually be a C3. Select the C radio button and then 3 from the drop-down list below. Once the CE type has been selected, you will enter your project description. This is where you can start off by entering the county name. The project description is usually about a paragraph long and can contain information such as how long the trail is, where exactly it is located, and what updates will be made. The next question is really important because this is where you are saying that this action will not induce significant impacts to planned growth or land use for the area, travel patterns, involve significant air or water quality impacts, or cause substantial controversies on environmental grounds. That is what makes this a CE. If you cannot verify that, it means the project cannot be a categorical exclusion and you would need to contact OEM. Otherwise, click the Verify checkbox to proceed with the Type 1 CE. This will open up the rest of the form. Here, we will discuss each question. Each question has different information needed and different requirements for the documentation to be considered complete. Once the documentation is complete for a question, the red exclamation point will turn into a green check mark. The first question is about right-of-way. Is it within the existing right-of-way, or are there minor acquisition without relocation and/or displacement? Depending on your answer, you might be asked to enter additional information. You can enter general comments for each question on how you determine your selection. The second question is about wetlands impacts. No wetlands present, no impacts, nationwide permit, or a standard permit. In general, these projects will be under the nationwide permit. The next question is about bridge permits. There are no waterway crossings, no U.S. Coast Guard bridge permit required, or U.S. Coast Guard bridge permit required. The next question is about floodplains. No floodplains present, no floodplain impact, functionally dependent use or facilitate open space use, or other encroachment. Then number 5 deals with wild and scenic rivers or a study river. (5B) will involve a river on the Nationwide Rivers Inventory or NRI. Question number 6 involves the Endangered Species Act. The next question is about Section 4F. The FDEP grants program project qualify as an exception, and we've automatically placed a standard statement for the question response. Question number 8 is related to cultural resources in Section 106. This question will always require documentation in the form of a document upload regardless of what the option is selected. You can choose your file, update your file name, add a title or brief description, or update the publication date. The next few questions: is this an attorney work product? Or is this part of the administrative record? And is this potentially exempt from public record? Are defaulted to the most common answers. No, this is not an attorney work product. Yes, this is part of the administrative record. And no, this is not exempt from public record. The last question is one to pay attention to in case your document includes location to historical information that you would not want to be made public. The next section is the supported questions. This section will allow you to associate what questions the document being uploaded supports. In some cases, you might have one document that contains information to several questions, and you could select those questions if needed. Otherwise, it defaults to the question where the document is being uploaded. Additional comments are optional for question number 8. The next question is about noise. It either does or does not require analysis. Upload your supporting documentation. Question number 10 is related to contamination. An evaluation is required for all projects. Documentation and general comments are required for this question. The next question is about planning consistency. Upload your documentation. This section lists all of the documents that have been uploaded to support the checklist. Once you have entered your project information, save your project as a draft. You can assign a project manager by clicking the green Assign PM button. This will be a list of staff that have been assigned the project manager role for the FDEP organization. Start typing the name of the person you would like to add as the PM. Click the Save button to save the project manager. After your checklist is complete and you are ready to send it to the project manager to begin the approval process, click the Send to PM button. The project manager will get a notification and an alert letting them know that a project is ready for their review. When the Type 1 CE checklist gets sent to the project manager, the PM will receive a notification and an alert letting them know that a checklist is ready for their review. Here is an example of the notification that the PM will receive. It contains the basic project information and a direct link to the Type 1 CE. The project manager can also log into SWEPT and view the district signatures report. Clicking on the Review button will take the PM directly to the Type 1 CE checklist that needs to be processed. When the form loads, the project manager can review the form, or they can download a PDF of the checklist. The PDF contains all of the basic project information, the description, and the responses to all of the questions answered by the data entry user. Links to the supporting documentation are also provided in the PDF. When the PM has completed their review, they can send it for approval, or if they feel there's more information needed, they can return it to their editors. When they send it for approval, OEM will receive a notification letting them know that the checklist is ready for their review.
It looks like there's a question from Barbara. Can you restate the requirements for contamination documentation? Who does that need to come from? Do you want to address
Sure.
that?
That documentation is going to come from the applicant. A level 1 is the typical contamination documentation that we would require. The applicant would probably get a consultant to provide that support for contamination for your particular project. If you don't have that expertise in-house. Sorry about that.
No, it's okay. And one thing that, just to point out, at the bottom of the agenda, which is attached as a handout, is the link to our PD&E manual. So the expectations about all those different questions and resources are in that manual as well, more details. And then the next question, Ruth, when you're referring to a project manager, is this an internal county project manager or a state? Oh, this is the FDEP grant program. So as an applicant, you will have a username, password to SWEPT, which DEP will let us know who the folks are that will have those accounts. They'll let 2 know, and then we'll set up the accounts. And once you fill out your type 1 CE, it will first go to DEP, and then a person at DEP, and then they'll forward it to 2 for review and approval. So it's that 2-step approval process. Are there any more questions?
I don't see any, but I do notice that we have a couple of hands raised. So Barbara, was that your question that you hopefully added onto the chat box? Does that address your issue? And then also Donna and Katie, if you can put your question in the box, that would help us out as well. All right, perfect. Thanks, Barbara. Thanks for putting it in the question box. I see a question about who can complete cultural forms, who can complete noise, etc. I think what typically will happen is, as the applicant, you are probably, if you don't have that expertise in-house, you're probably going to be acquiring the support of a consultant to help you prepare your type 1 CE and complete the appropriate analysis. So, you're going to need to have a biologist to do the species section. You're going to have someone that is meets the requirements for cultural resources, as Roy talked about earlier, so forth and so on. So you're going to be needing to do those. The next question about what is the average cost for consultant help, and that's just going to depend on the scope of your project as well. I don't have an answer for you for that one, but if anyone on our team or has an answer to that, please feel free to share.
I was just going to add too that it ultimately depends on the level of involvement with the types of resources that are being examined and the relationship of the project to those resources. There's no other way to answer that question. The costs come in by hour and by task. And some tasks are required to be completed, others wouldn't be. For example, if you identified no historic resources at all, then you would not have to worry about the evaluation of them and the coordination of that evaluation with the consulting party. So it depends on the complexity and the level of involvement.
Right, thanks, Roy.
Maybe Roy, to your point about the hours, we do have a staff hour estimation guideline that doesn't necessarily directly relate to a cost, but it's a tool that at least, someone could look at to gauge, depending on that complexity, what maybe a reasonable range of hours might be per resource or issue that you might have on a particular project where you do need to get a consultant to support you on those efforts.
Yeah, Katasha is 100% right. If there's a certain amount of hours that may be required per site file form for an historic building, a certain amount of hours related to a site file form per an archaeological site, and so forth.
Thanks, Roy and Katasha. I see a question on here, and we might need some support from our DEP Rec Trail staff. How long does the whole process take from start to finish? Grant timelines are very tight between agreement approval and the project having to start.
Hey, so this is Tara, Recreational Trails Program with DEP. It's my understanding that the NEPA documentation that's been presented by FDEP, as well as the Task 1 documentation with us, FDEP, will all be required. So actually, once the priority list has been approved by Federal Highway, all of the projects that were approved for funding will need to submit their NEPA documentation, and then depending on the outcome of that eligibility, then you'll move into, we'll execute a grant agreement, and then once the grant agreements are executed, then the grantees will have 180 days to submit their Task 1 documentation.
Thanks, Tara. Oops, my questions just moved around. There's a question about, does FDOT or FDEP have recommendations on consultants or contracts to piggy off of? Does anyone? Katasha, do you want to take that one?
So too, the only thing I think we could potentially say is that we may be able to get a list of pre-qualified consultants from our procurement office, but we can't really make recommendations.
Right, that's what I thought too, thank you. The next question, will these forms be expected prior to funding approval? These consultant fees can be expensive and prohibitive. And I think that question can probably be better answered by an FDEP representative about the funding mechanism. I'm not sure exactly when dollars are actually given to the grantees.
So once the priority list has been approved, grantees, I believe we're including NEPA expenses as part of any pre-agreement expenses that can be requested at the time of reimbursement. But typically, any cost incurred during this planning period is usually reimbursed as a single payment at the very end once the project's complete. But I believe with some of our 19 projects, and we'll discuss this more in the afternoon segment, if any projects already have planning expenses included in their scope of work, then those grantees are eligible to request biannual payments. And again, we'll go over that more this afternoon, but NEPA costs and the cost to prepare this documentation will be included with planning expenses.
Thanks, Tara. We have a question from Julie, and I think this is in reference to the staff hour sheet. Where is the hour sheet located? And I don't know if that's openly available to the public or if that's something internal. Katasha, can you help out with that one?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure we have that posted on a website that's available, and I was chatting to the organizers that we may be able to add that on the list of resources or share that after.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Regarding wildlife natural resources for the grant project that we currently have, we use FNA to acquire these inventories. Is that no longer acceptable? I think FNA is one of those resources, but when it comes to protected species, federally listed species, definitely reach out to U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and their resources and National Marine Fisheries Service to get the exact list in your project area. Katasha, did you have any thoughts on FNA being the only resource?
I agree with you too. I mean, per the actually Endangered Species Act and the FHWA guidance that we have to follow, we really have to go to the source, which is Fish and Wildlife Service or National Marine Fisheries. And so, like Tu had suggested earlier, there are tools out there that you can use to get a list of, the potential species within your project limits, and then you can kind of do some additional field work or whatever to narrow down that list as you're looking to determine whether you need to go through consultation or not.
Perfect, thank you. The next question from Katie. Our project is very small, just a number of square feet. Base fees for consultants may not reflect this small size and simplicity. What should we do when consultant fees may significantly offset or eat into our grant award? I think, Tara, is that something that you would like to answer? I think from the funding aspect, I'm going to pass that off to FDEP staff.
Sue, can you repeat that?
It says, this question is from Katie McMillan. Our project is very small, just a number of square feet. Base fees for consultants may not reflect this small size and simplicity. What should we do when consultant fees may significantly offset or eat into our grant award?
So as far as the planning expenses, grantees can only request up to 15% of the total project cost. So unfortunately, if there's a large chunk of planning expenses for your project, the amount that is eligible for reimbursement is only 15% of the actual total project cost. That's all that we are allowed to reimburse for as far as planning expenses go. The other remaining costs are to be paid for by the grantee.
All right, thanks, Tara. I think the next question is also yours. Can the investment made in the NEPA process be utilized as a match?
I'd have to consult with Rebecca on that. She stepped out for a minute, but I want to say probably not. I think we're including NEPA as part of a planning expense and not necessarily part of like construction of the project. But again, I can confirm that with her and we can kind of send out a follow-up email to all the grantees about that.
Perfect, thank you. Our next question, in circumstances where a consultant finds that no impact will occur, is a memo or letter sufficient documentation? Ultimately, when we're making that decision and the documentation we're looking for, we have to have the appropriate justification that there are no impacts. So they're gonna need to, identify whether they did a field for species or wetlands, for example. There's a field visit, maybe looking at providing GIS maps of the project area showing that there are no wetland impacts, for example. So we need to have documentation to support that there are going to be no impacts. So hopefully that's helpful, Barbara. And then one more question for you, Tara. So is there a time frame between being approved and getting the NEPA complete and an agreement in place?
That's a good question. I don't really know the time frame. Usually it's a quick turnaround between when the priority list of signing grant agreements are executed. However, since NEPA is going to be required prior to the execution of a grant agreement, we'll probably have to establish a timeline for that. It was my understanding that it would be 180 days, similar to that of task 1 for commencement. But again, I'll probably have to confirm that since it's not really going to be due at the time of commencement, it's going to be due prior. So again, I'll confirm that with Rebecca and send that in the follow-up email to the grantees.
Thanks, Tara. And I think that was our last question, unless someone, other folks have more questions to add into the chat box. I mean, the question box, sorry.
Two, did you see the one from Barbara? In circumstances where a consultant finds that no impact will occur, as a memo or letter sufficient documentation?
Yes, and I think I answered that one where ultimately we're still going to need some kind of justification where there is no impact. You know, a memo, a letter is sufficient with the appropriate justification. So, you know, maps showing the project area, you know, for example, if there are no wetlands in the area, you know, that can provide the supporting information that's needed. Because oftentimes we can just say no impact, but we really need to provide appropriate documentation to demonstrate that.
Thank you. Okay, seeing no more questions, I think that's it for the webinar. So the plan is to see if we can see, oh, Julie just asked, having examples of completed, I think you mean the type 1 CE and supporting documents, and 2 had mentioned she was going to try and find those so we can post those. So our plan is to post this recording, post all the PowerPoints that were presented. We're also going to separately post the SWEPT video, so if that's all you need to watch, you don't have to go through the whole webinar. And then we'll get that link for the staff hours, come up with an example, and we'll post all those on our website so that you have access to them. So that's our plan in wrapping this up. And of course, if you have any questions with more project specific questions, we're always here to help. So just let us know. Thank you very much.